It is indeed a great pleasure and honor to invite the guest to the World Federation Neurology YouTube channel and social media team on behalf of World Brain Day team today. He absolutely does not need introduction to the World Federation Neurology. He's a giant in our group and he's a collaborator, very inclusive leader, Professor Vladimir Hachinski. He was indeed the president of our society when the World Brain Day concept was brought to reality, which started as a sort of a little the coffee over chat. He made it a reality at the 2000 meeting. Without further ado, Professor Vladimir Hachinski, very good day to you. Very warm welcome to the World Brain Day edition of our YouTube channel, the conversation.
Thank you very much.
The Professor Hachinski, you have an illustrious career, and I'm not going to bore our viewers to death by going through it, but I want to ask this question to you. Tell us the making of Professor Vladimir Hachinski from your early days to the medical school. What inspired you to be interested in brain neurology and where you are now? I know that this is going to be a long answer, but I'm sure our viewers are keen to know.
Well, when I was a boy, I had two interests, medicine always, but I also was just interested in history. So I had to make a decision whether I was going to do medicine or history. And for very good reasons, I chose medicine. I had not intended to be a specialist. I wanted to be a doctor in a small town near Toronto where I worked in the summer as a medical student. But then my wife, who was very perceptive, said, look, you will not last as a family physician. You're too curious. You don't feel you know enough. So I decided to do internal medicine. And so I graduated from the University of Toronto Medicine, then went to the McGill University in Montreal, and I was doing internal medicine. Then, by accident, there was in one of the rotations was supposed to be an investigational unit that I was assigned to. However, the radiologists in Quebec, the province where Montreal is, were on strike. So they put me into the neurology work. Now, like most medical students, I was afraid of neurology. It's too complicated. After all, it's the brain. So Dr. Donald Baxter, who was the chief of the service, who became the director of the Montreal Neurological Institute, had a case discussion. And this was a gentleman, probably in his early 60s. And there were a number of trainees standing around. And I tried to be not that visible. I was standing at the end of the bed. And of course, it's hard to disguise when you're 6'2". So he asked everybody what their opinion was. Now, I didn't quite get the history. I didn't quite hear what the man said because he was French Canadian. I have limited French. I didn't quite understand what the history was. But my opinion was asked nevertheless. And I had noted that this patient had a ulcer in his left foot. And I asked whether the patient was diabetic, and the answer was no. So then I said, may I examine the patient? And he said, yes. So I squeezed his Achilles tendon on the left foot. And then I squeezed the left testicle. He didn't seem to mind, didn't seem to experience pain. And I said, you're a syphilis, sir. And of course, the trainees in neurology looked at me as I was crazy. I wasn't sure that I was right. But 2 weeks later, that they proved that he had neurosyphilis. And so, of course, all of a sudden I had this immediate reputation that I was very knowledgeable in neurology. So I had to live up to the reputation. I had to work very hard. And then I really got interested. But then I'm very action-oriented. I want to do things. You know, I like neurology, but I also want to do something. And at the time, there wasn't that much therapy. So the only doubt I had was, is there enough therapy in neurology to make a difference? So then I saw a patient, a private patient. In those days, we had a system whereby they're private patients and public patients for Dr. Baxter. And this is a 30-year-old woman who came in with a stiff neck and a slight fever. And I examined her, and Dr. Baxter came in. This was at night. And he asked me what I thought. And I said, sir, I think she has meningitis. And he said, well, why not subarachnoid hemorrhage? I mean, it could be. And I said, well, it could be, sir, but I'm fairly sure. Now, don't ask me why I was so sure. But in any case, I did a lumbar puncture. Dr. Baxter examined the fluid, and he found that indeed she had a roaring meningitis, and we cured her. Then I thought to myself, well, you know, you can do some things in neurology. I decided to become a neurologist. But then there was another lucky accident, and that is that having decided I was going to do neurology, in the second year, that was when I was a first-year trainee in internal medicine. For the second year, we had a choice of 1 month rotation. We could select anything we wanted. And I selected neuropathology. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Finlayson, who was both a neurologist and neuropathologist, said, well, in 1 month, you won't learn enough neurology to be neuropathology, to be any help to me. And certainly you will not learn enough to learn enough neuropathology to be any help to you. He said, I have a suggestion for you. I said, why don't you spend the month reviewing the literature and making notes for the medical students at McGill University on stroke? So that's what I did. I became fascinated by it.
Right.
So that's how I became interested in stroke. And then I'll just have a third lucky accident, and then I think I'll stop. Now, the third lucky accident, I decided to do stroke, and I wanted to learn cerebral blood flow study so we can look at the pathophysiology of stroke. So I went to the National Hospital for Nervous Disease in London, England, and I wanted to learn how to do cerebral blood flow in acute stroke patients. They told me that stroke was not a neurological condition. They did not admit stroke patients. So they said, well, you have to do a study. Well, I only was there 6 months, a very short time. And Professor Marshall, John Marshall, who was my supervisor, said, well, there's only one thing I can offer you in 6 months, and that is, why don't you study dementia? Because at the time, everybody thought it was hardening of the arteries and that there's chronic ischemia. So I designed a study in which I looked at what I call multi-infarct dementia. That's where I invented the term. And I invented a scale how to diagnose it and compared it to patients who had what I call primary degenerative dementia, because I didn't think I was smart enough to tell the subtype. In any case, we showed that unlike what you expect with chronic ischemia, the reactivity of the blood vessel was equally vigorous in both groups. So therefore, this idea of selling vasodilators for treating dementia had no scientific basis. And after that, an industry that had become quite large deflated and died. So that gives you a background of my interest both in stroke and in dementia.
So you had great mentors, some accidental luck that you converted to really fruitful experiences and expansion of knowledge compared to the way that we were thinking and what you got to start thinking now with all the new knowledge that was added to the literature. Tell us how you got involved with the Stroke Journal. You became the editor-in-chief of Stroke Journal for almost well over a decade, if I recall.
That wasn't quite an accident. I never aspired to it because, you see, by the time that I became a candidate, pretty well all the editors have been retired, and for them it was largely a full-time job. For example, Dr. Dyken, who was the editor at the time, he taught some medical students, but apart from that, the journal was it. And I was extremely busy, and it's not something that I wanted to do at that time in my career. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Dyken said, well, I understand you cannot be an editor, but I said, don't assume you get elected, They're more senior people who'll be interested in the job. So, but you can do the journal a favor, and you can do yourself a favor if you become a candidate, because you say you I have lots of ideas, and the committee can hear something that it might be of interest. So I said, oh yeah, I can do that. And then I enthusiastically went, and I was interviewed. And since I did not have the ambition for the job, I told them exactly what I would do, and they liked it. I had two competitors. If I told you the names, you would recognize them. Quite senior, highly respected people. So they offered me the job. And apart from being a doctor, I must say it was probably one of the most enjoyable jobs I ever held.
And I think Stroke Journal, there were some golden 10 years of Stroke Journal, which I regularly read.
Yeah, I didn't realize that offered such a wonderful platform. So there are several things we did, actually. The first one is I thought, we really have to reach out to the whole world. Mm-hmm. So I introduced the 9 different editions, mm-hmm. A Chinese edition, a Russian edition, an Italian edition, a Spanish edition, and then an edition in English, but for India. Mm-hmm. So we reached out. The second thing we did is that I felt that, we know so little about stroke in low-income and middle-country. And some of our colleagues, they try to publish, but it's very hard to publish internationally. So I started a mentorship program whereby anyone from a number of countries, these were low-income countries by and large, and some middle countries, if they had a paper they wanted to have considered by stroke, they would send it directly to me. Mm-hmm. And I would assign it to one of the members of the board. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, I had no problem finding mentors. Mm-hmm. Dr. Kaplan was particularly good. He was enthusiastic. And what happened was that they helped make the paper as good as it could be. Mm-hmm. And also, then sort of in a way, the author had a mentor who was part of the board. And so I established, so indirectly, there was also sort of a program of mentorship. Mm-hmm. Now, then once the paper was written, they were not allowed to acknowledge the mentor, because mm-hmm. if you did that, you might have an advantage. So I wanted that any paper submitted to Stroke would go through the same rigorous process. Mm-hmm. And if they made it, then it was on the same merits, not because they were from a different country. Mm-hmm. Now, interesting enough, so we published, excuse me, most papers did not make it to Stroke. We had a very high standard. I think we admitted we only accepted about 15% mm-hmm. of submissions. However, most of them made it into the national journal, so they made it into the literature. Mm-hmm. And then from time to time, I would actually commission the sort of reviews from countries where there are not a lot of statistics, but our colleagues who had some knowledge to sort of say, this is not a scientific paper, this is a commentary about the need to know more. And then the third thing we did was that at the end of my tenure, I got a sort of a meeting, I called it a synergium. A symposium, as you know, in Greek means drinking together. Mm-hmm. So often in symposia, you drink together, a lot of talk, something is published and nothing happens. By synergium is also Greek meaning working together. And the idea was that we would do something that could be implemented. So we had working groups in different epidemiology, basic science, clinical, etc. And so we had these working groups working even before the Zoom days, working virtually. And then we had an actual meeting and then produced a document called Towards a World Stroke Agenda. Mm-hmm. And that document had some influence. For example, in Brazil, it was adopted as a source document to produce the national stroke plan. So that was a wonderful, I know the other thing I did also is that I enlarged the board and I recruited people from other parts of the world. Also more women, more people in the younger. I mean, at the time, we were not so conscious about including women, including minorities, it was not a policy. Like, that was not part of what was imposed on me. We did it because, I was born in Europe. I grew up in Latin America, and I've been in Canada since I'm 17. So I'm very aware of a larger world. And the world, so I think part of that was driven by the fact that that we all, it's a small world after all, as one of the songs says. And the other one is that, like myself, I never thought I was going to be editor of Stroke. I never aspired to many things, and the opportunities were given to me. So as far as we could to the journal, we try to offer opportunities to others.
I think you spot on the Vladimir, I can relate to that, having gone through the similar sort of path, being born in very rural Sri Lanka, trained in New Zealand, and now living in Melbourne, Australia, moving back and forth to Sri Lanka pre-COVID time fairly regularly. And you're absolutely right. When you see more of the world, you realize the strength of diversity and strength of having many things. It basically add value to the world. Interestingly, I sat on the number of grant the bodies as an assessor of recent years. Last year, I was invited to sit in Canadian chair appointment committee as an external assessor. That was a unique experience. I have never seen such a rigorous process to give quota. Still, people have to fulfill basic criteria, of course. They were very rigorous on assessment, but there was specific quota for women, specific quota for the Indigenous Canadians, specific quota for other minorities. I have not experienced to such an extent in any other country. I mean, I haven't assessed all countries, but I have been to many the well-developed countries, and I would probably put Canada way above everyone else, having gone through that the process. It was painful because I was basically sleepless for 3 nights in a row. We did it virtually. I got another question for you also. I think before I come to that question, let's ask from you how you got involved with World Federation Neurology. When was the first year that you got involved with WFN?
Yes, actually, my original involvement was with the Pan American Congress of Neurology. Mm-hmm. The reason is that I grew up in Venezuela, mm-hmm. And there was going to be a congress in Caracas, the capital, and I got invited to organize a session on cerebrovascular disease. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a bit of a story behind that, and that is that I was very junior. That was at the big. I was an assistant professor. I just started my career, but of course, I always kept in touch with my friends in Venezuela, and so I was known in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. So they asked a very senior neurologist, American neurologist, to organize the session. But what had happened is that the Ministry of Communication went on strike. So that meant there was no telephone communication, there was no letters, and essentially there was no communication whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And so it was very difficult for the American neurologist to organize that. And he said, look, I cannot organize it like that. I mean, I just can't. I mean, I'd love to help you, but I cannot. Mm-hmm. So what they did is one of the neurologists flew to Miami. Mm-hmm. And telephone me. So anyway, happy ending. We organized it. It was highly successful. It was one of the most successful congresses I attended. And the good thing about that is that because of all the visibility of neurology at the time, the Ministry of Health actually created a special section on neurology. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, then I became particularly involved with the Pan American Congresses and Latin American Neurology. And then there was a meeting in Buenos Aires. I had a lot to do with it in the fact that I was an honorary member of Bolivia, mm-hmm. Of the country of Bolivia. They couldn't send a delegate to a meeting where they were going to decide where the next meeting was going to be. Mm-hmm. And so they asked me to represent Bolivia. Mm-hmm. So we were competing with a number of European cities. And I was advocating on behalf of Buenos Aires. And so anyway, the argument had been that there are a number of European countries and that they together had many more sort of votes to go to Europe than to Latin America. And I said, you talk about Europe. I said, of the dozen of congresses that have been held, they all have been held in the Northern Hemisphere. Never in the long history of the World Federation of Neurology has it ever been in the Southern Hemisphere. Isn't it about time?
Right.
Anyway, we got it to Buenos Aires. And there, I spent quite a bit of time with Lord Walton. We got invited to the home of a Uruguayan neurologist, and we had a long chat. And he started telling me what I needed to do to become president of the World Federation of Neurology. And I said, oh my God. I mean, at that time, I thought, you know, that's sort of far remote into the future. And so, well, I became more interested. And I did go to the World Congresses, including the one in India. And then the next thing that happened is that I knew Dr. Toole. Toole, of course, was one of the big names in stroke. And he had written a book. And I had contributed a chapter on cerebral blood flow and metabolism to his book. So he was, so when he became president, he made me the chair of the steering committee. So I became very involved with that. So then I was involved. And then Dr. Amos Korchin, an Israeli neurologist, said to me, Vladimir, you should run for president. Well, again, I was just too busy. I said, I just can't. I mean, there are too many things. And if I become president, I want to do a good job. So then I thought to myself, yeah, well, actually, I said, no, I don't have time for president, but why don't I run for vice president? So I ran for vice president. And then as vice president, I really enjoyed being vice president. And that is, you know, you don't have as much responsibility and you can do something and you work with the president. And Dr. Ali, Professor Ali, President Ali was wonderful, He started an Africa initiative. And then my main task is to prepare the documentation and the case for moving the congresses from every 4 years to every 2 years. There was a bit of resistance because, you know, tradition had been 4 years. And I made the argument, we discussed it at delegates meetings, etc. And finally we adopted that. And that turned out to be the most important thing that I did during my presidency. Because then all of a sudden, the philosophy was that we would make money in some of the cities that are popular, for example, Vienna. But then we had the money to go to a place where we may not make money, but the idea that we need to worry not about the people who can travel like ourselves. We can travel anywhere. We have to worry about the people who cannot travel and who need neurology. So the idea was to take neurology to work, you know, as close to the neurologists as possible. So one advantage was that, in fact, we never had to subsidize any Congress. They were so successful that it doesn't matter where we went, including countries that were less affluent, we made money. So we're able to go, we doubled the number of geographic places where we could go. The second advantage was that we actually had more money, and I used it to give small grants to in obviously low-income countries, and along the same lines, Professor Ali had created the African initiative, but then I created the Asian and Latin American one. And a particularly nice story is that Raji Kaji, who is the vice president now, I put him in charge of the Asia initiative, and he was very keen to organize formally that region. So we gave him a small amount of money, seed money, to get organized. Well, before my term was over, he created just the whole organization. And then the other thing, which comes back to the World Day, is that I had initiated a World Stroke Day, and with other colleagues, we developed an agenda for stroke. to go along with the day. So we called it a proclamation. And it was addressed to policymakers and to the public. So it's written in very simple language. So the Stroke Day has become very successful, just like the World Brain Day is. So, so your predecessor, Mohammed Wassey, was in charge of your committee. And we had a discussion in Marrakesh.
I'll actually come to that. Before you tell the secret.
Okay, I won't tell the secret.
I got a question to.
Yeah, let me draw the parallel. We'll come back to the specifics, but there is a parallel between the World Stroke Day and the World Brain Health Day, because we developed a formal proclamation for the Stroke Day, but now we are working on something equivalent for the World Brain Day. Anyway, your question.
My question is I'll let you tell the story of this later on. Before that, at Bangkok, the World Congress, that was my second the Congress with WFN. My first Congress was 2005. I was still a final year trainee at that time. I cried at 2005 World Congress, having seen how they replicated the first neurological examination, and they were depicting charcoal and a whole lot of things. I read the history, but seeing someone acting that and predicting it to a younger guy who is in sort of very early stages of not even a board certified neurologist was quite amazing. And then when I went to Bangkok, I was basically nobody. I had one sort of a no unread type of a paper under my belt. That was the only publication. Nobody exactly knew. And I saw the session, basically it was chaired by you, but I didn't know who you were at that time. I knew your name, but I didn't know who you were. And it was hard for a young guy to recognize who the president or who the vice president, this and that. It was basically a workshop for neurologists and trainees from low to middle income countries. And I was shy, so I didn't ask any questions. I stayed behind. And then I didn't agree with one of the speakers' comments on some of the issues pertaining to developing world. I still kept quiet. I was scared to raise the issue. But as things accumulated in my mind, when question and answer session came, I raised my hand up. And then I remember introducing myself, saying that I was usual story, born in rural Sri Lanka, grew up and trained in New Zealand, currently working in Australia. And then I sort of gave some statistics of Asia, Oceania region, and I sort of rambled away some of the things that I have seen in Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh that I have visited in the past. Then you corrected my statistics, I think from about 1% or 1.2%, and you sort of settled the issue between me and the speaker. So that was that. I enjoyed the rest of the conference and came home. And 5 days later, I got an email from Rebecca, your PA at that time. I still keep it with me. And it went something like this. Dear Dr. Wijeratne, the WFN President, Professor Hachinski, took the serious note on what you mentioned as issues pertaining to the region. He would like to invite you to sit in the education committee to represent that region and then act on the things that you mentioned. My question to you is, not knowing who I was, knowing that my CV was pretty blank at that time, why did you trust a young guy like that to see whether he or she would deliver?
It's something that you also have. It's called clinical judgment. When you see a patient, for example, you have to assess not only what the problem is, but what they're like, right? And you have an impression, you form. And typically, first impressions are fairly reliable. What happens is that the first impressions are often reliable, but then after a while, you get to know the person and you lose track of what the first impression is. And so it takes a very long time to rediscover what you thought at the beginning. So I pride myself in being able to assess. Of course, it's not perfect, but I think I do rather well, particularly young people. For example, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, there were two new trainees that came to work with one of my colleagues in another area. And I was doing a project with this colleague. And there were obviously two young people who came and potentially could be involved in the trial. And then I exchanged a few words with each of them. And afterwards, I said to my colleague, I want Dr. X to be part of the job. And I said, why do you say that? And I said, I think he'd be the best of the two. And I said, how do you know that? You don't even know the CV, you don't know anything. I said, well, I said, I'm making a suggestion. It's your decision. Sure enough, that's what happened. So I think that's my other, so I made a clinical judgment, and obviously it was a good one. That's why you interviewing me here.
And in fact, I heard the same story about many others who are doing a tremendous job for WFN that you picked during your time for various committees.
One of the important things we have to develop is, the talent to spot talent. In other words, that should be the job of those of us who are in positions to actually influence someone else's career. I mean, what is their potential? And also point it out to them, because most young people are not aware what their potential is. And most good people underestimate their potential. The poor people think they're terrific. I mean, if you meet people and they're arrogant, chances are they're not very good. The people who really have accomplished anything are aware what they cannot do, and that most important things cannot be done alone, particularly in medicine.
Now let you go back to the World Brain Day story.
Yeah, no. Well, the story there was that, again, we wanted to have something that again, action. I said at the beginning that I'm very action oriented, so I don't want to just produce a document. I want something done with it. So we produced. I just chaired the committee that produced a proclamation, and the proclamation was for essentially stroke and vascular cognitive impairment. Most people don't realize that most people who have a stroke don't know it. And that is because for each clinical stroke, there are 5 silent ones. They don't affect the body, they affect cognition. So I was very aware that we should have vascular cognitive impairment. So we produced that document, and remarkably, we got the endorsement of 24 organizations. The World Stroke Organization was the sponsor, but then we had the Alzheimer's Association, the Heart Federation, just the 24. So international, the American Academy of Neurology, the European Academy of Neurology. So a total of 24 international, regional, and national organizations. And so this was part of a policy for us to pursue stroke together with cognitive impairment. And so the World Stroke Organization has published twice now follow-up documents sort of saying we have to look at these together, the Joint Prevention of Stroke and Dementia. And then there's a document that's called Preventing Dementia by Preventing Stroke. We call it the Berlin Manifesto. Again, spelling out the scientific basis for doing so. And then lately, again, there's a story in this. So what I'm saying to you is that we have to not only produce evidence, we have to help implement it. Now, the latest interest, by the way, I'm lucky enough that we showed in the province of Ontario, which is the largest province in Canada, that following a stroke strategy, meaning that the government invested in building stroke units, stroke prevention clinics, and public campaigns in risk factor control, that over a 12-year period, the incidence of stroke in Ontario has decreased by 32% and of dementia by 7%. We know that dementia is untreatable, but it looks as if it's preventable. And now we have a grant, we just got it. It's a 3-year grant to look at why. What is it that we're doing right to prevent dementia? Now, if you take the population of 14 million of the province of Ontario, multiply by 7%, you're talking about thousands of people who did not have dementia or did not have a stroke. So we are pursuing now Canada-wide, not just Ontario, Canada-wide. What is it that we're doing that is right? And then we also know that there's too much concentration on individual risk factors. But we have to do both individual risk factor control, but also at the population level. For example, a 2 millimeter decrease in systolic blood pressure in the individual is desirable, but it's hardly significant. On the other hand, if we manage to decrease the blood pressure in a population by 2%, it has been calculated, you decrease the incidence of stroke by 25%. So we're looking at everything. We're looking at environment. We have a health geographer. We're looking at social demographics, where you live, what you do, with whom you live. They all have an influence on the risk factors. And then we're looking at individual risk factors. So this is what we're doing at the Canadian level. Now, when I was president of the World Federation of Neurology, the United Nations was about to pass the second resolution in their history about health. The first one had been about HIV. So I was concerned because they've targeted 4 conditions, but there was no brain involved. It was brainless as far as I could tell. So I thought that our voice would be stronger with the World Federation of Neurology if we formed a World Brain Alliance. So we got 12 organizations, the major organizations dealing with the brain, like the International Brain Research Organization, Alzheimer International, the International Organization of Neurorehabilitation, and then the World Heart Federation, to endorse, to endorse a declaration about brain health. We called it the World Brain Alliance. And we based it on 3 premises. The first one is there is no health without brain health. If you cannot look after yourself, then you cannot be healthy, you cannot look after others. The second one is that brain health begins with the mothers and the child and their education, which is fundamental. And thirdly, our brains are our future. And the reason is that in the digital age, most of the jobs are going to require a higher degree of cognitive competence than in the past. And that, by the way, is the theme I suggested to your predecessor, Dr. Wasay, as a theme for the World Brain Day. In any case, so what happened is that in Europe, there is a movement now to have the European community adopt the brain health as a top priority. And I've been part of that. I've been invited to participate in some of these discussions that have taken place. But I was struck by the fact that there is no agreed definition. So we offered a definition that was published. And essentially, it's based on the WHO definition of health, but it adds the brain. And it says that brain health is not simply the absence of disease. It's the full enjoyment of physical, mental, and social well-being through a continuous development of the brain and exercise of the brain. Now, continuous development, we are very aware that children develop the brain very quickly, but we never cease to reshape our brain. This conversation will result in tens of thousands of new synapses in your brain and mine. Our brains will be different because of this interaction.
Absolutely.
And then, so it's important to know that if you want to have brain health, you have to continually exercise it. And by exercise, we tend to think of brain power as just being emotion. But it isn't just a cognition, it's emotion. Emotion is a very important thing to exercise. And we have come to appreciate that with the pandemic.
Absolutely.
We need to exercise our brains. And the third one is also motion. So there are 3 things that are important in the brain exercise. Well, one is, cognition, emotion, and motion. And then we tend to think of the brainy people like Einstein. But, I watched the finals of tennis. And, to be a champion tennis player, you have to be smart. You have to think of strategy. You have to be physically fit. And you have to be passionate about it. So we have to begin recognizing that we all need our brains, whatever we're doing, whether we're sports people, whether we're professors, or whether we're artists. And then now the definition is rather brief that we published. And now we are preparing a document that involves many, many people who were involved in the in fact, in the World Brain Alliance and many others. And again, here, very consciously, we have people who are from different parts of the world. And again, women, and in fact, luckily, we now have women in leadership positions that can be given position of authority because they deserve it. In the past, too few of them had the experience to have a senior job. And now there are enough of them. So this document will be, it's not, this document is being prepared. We have something like 33 authors and it's very diverse. And the idea is that we are outlining things that are possible. In other words, we're trying to target organizations and governments that can do something about it. And one of our targets to really try to persuade organizations is the G7, and it's not exclusive, but that's a good one because first of all, there are the richest countries in the world. Secondly, they have a major problem in brain. All of them are aging societies, and they need to do something about it. And then thirdly, there are only 7 of them, so you're much more likely to get agreement among 7 countries than the rest. And of course, that would be the building block to expand it, the G20, and then, have it. So part of our agenda is to actually try to help those in authority to implement things. And I think it's important to qualify that generic solutions don't work. For example, Canada, you can say, well, Canada should do X, Y, and Z. But we are a very diverse country. The risk factors in London, Ontario are different than in Northern Canada. And so part of the project we're doing, we're targeting actionable communities. In other words, what is the unit where you can actually make a change? And what is the main problem? For example, in London, Ontario, Canada, hypertension is not a major problem. We're a medical center, and luckily we control that very well. On the other hand, obesity is rising, becoming a problem. In Northern Ontario, hypertension is rampant. That's a big problem. So the idea is that in the things we're recommending, there have been 3 things. First, comprehensive, look at everything. Secondly, target. What's the thing that's likely to pay the most? And thirdly, make it cost effective. In other words, what's the return for investment, whether it's money for a project or the personal investment of changing your risk factors. So the document we're producing is very much a practical one. And I hope that it'll be published. Well, we haven't submitted it. In fact, one of the things we're doing today is looking at the semi-final version, so that we'll probably send it on within a week. And we're sending it to Lancet Neurology, where we publish the definition. And then with luck, we might have it published by the end of the year.
I think that would be very timely, given the pandemic basically reminding us that some of the wars that we have to fight, like this COVID-19 pandemic, I think while many countries' leaders wanted to fight a national fight, the scientific community has recognized this as a global fight. There's only one enemy.
Yeah, well, as a matter of fact, there is a document that was produced. It's actually a book as a background to the G7 meeting that took place in Britain. And they have articles by the heads of state, and of course, COVID by Tedros, the head of the WHO, etc. And I published an article there as well. And the argument you're making is precisely the one that you're making, that the pandemic has taught us that we're one world. We have to collaborate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the second thing is that people have come to appreciate how important and closely related are brain health and mental health. They're aspects of the same thing. So and the third thing that has happened is that we have been sort of imprisoned up to a point, and we have a better appreciation for the need to communicate. And one of the good things that happened, there are whole new communities and networks, virtual ones that didn't exist before. And we can take advantage of this to promote brain health and communication and well-being.
Absolutely. I think both myself and Muhammad Wasim, my predecessor, we were basically fed with these words regularly. I think at Marrakesh meeting and subsequent meetings, our vocabulary was full of one word, one brain, brain health, supreme wealth. The brain health is important. And looking back from what you have created with us at that time, the World Brain Day in 2014 and now 2021, when I was writing original things, now we have a commercial partner to help us with the develop things compared to earlier days. So most of the things that you see in the toolbox were commercially produced now. We give them the ideas, but they put professional artwork and make it much more professional than what we had. We still had good things, even earlier days. My ambitious agenda at that time was let's aim at 1 million social media posts so that 1 million would have about 100 to 1,000 followers. So that would get me 100 million. Then when I realized that there are 2.8 million people with multiple sclerosis, I change it overnight. I change it to 2.8. Neither the president or the rest of the other committee members didn't realize that I changed from 1 million target to 2.8 million target. Now all the virtual talks that I have been doing, I was telling my colleagues exactly what you said. Last 14 months showed us how resilient we are as a species. Last 14 months showed us how clever we can be if we want to, specifically if we want to work together. And I think this is ideal time for us to do what you have been telling for well over a decade, if not more, that the brain health is a single, universal, one-word health. And the virus has basically forced us to think it in that way.
Well, there's a bit of footnote about the origin of the mission of the WFM. When I became president, the mission was a paragraph. And I would ask people, what is the mission of WFN? And they said, well, research, education, etc. I said, no. Can you tell me? Well, it's rather long. I said, and I said, how can you know what your vision is if you can't remember what it is? So I changed it to one sentence. And that is that the mission of the World Federation of Neurology is to foster quality neurology and brain health worldwide. That's the mission. Anybody can memorize that. So it's interesting. We're evolving. You see, now we're coming to this stage, particularly with the pandemic. It's time now to talk about brain health. You know, we can, that encompasses the diseases. We cannot neglect them, but there's more. There's a positive aspect to that. And the other thing is that the brain, you know, there are other aspects that are important, emotion, you know, spirituality and so on. And they have, you know, they have a role. Mindfulness and things like that. And of course, up to now, we've been very reluctant to look at that because we say, well, it's not really hard science. But you know, there are cultures like in India where all these traditions of meditation and mindfulness and things have been used very successfully. We're beginning to understand in the terms of the brain. I mean, we know that the brains of people who meditate are different, etc. And that has become respectable. The other thing that's become respectable is we talk, well, what's happiness? Happiness, it is not a universal thing. In other words, the one thing it is not is simply being uniformly happy. There's no such thing. I mean, it's very boring to be happy all the time. I mean, life is full of, just like music. What would music be if you had just one nice note and played it all the time? You know, and happiness is a broader definition. It's living, it's change, it's interaction, etc. So we're finally reaching the stage where we can begin putting together not only different disciplines within medicine, but also psychology and the arts and the sciences, etc. After all, the brain is also the source of all creativity, of all actions. So I think little by little, we're coming to realize that the brain is indeed the key. And there is a quotation that I don't remember by heart, but I think you have access to it. It's that article I wrote where they highlighted it. And that is that the brain can be an intermediary it can be sort of the theme, an actionable idea about uniting not only actions about health, but also trying to integrate other aspects of human living.
Professor Hachinski, I'm sure you are super excited of how World Brain Day is expanding and the growing strength to strength. I think you have already given a lot of tips for our youngsters, and you are a well-rounded wise man. You are a terrific musician, and you have a lot of outside interests beyond brain health and medicine. Also, you have an exceptionally good work-life balance. You have a wonderful family. I had the luxury of hosting you sometimes back in Melbourne when you visited here pre-COVID times. What is your final message to those youngsters out there, wherever they are?
It's going to be a different world and probably a better world. And you can play a major role in it. Find out what you like, do it to your best of your ability, and the doors will open. And if by some chance you end up doing something that you don't like, learn to like it. It'll make a difference.
Very, very wise words. Thank you so much, Professor Hachinski. We wish you all the very best. We wish you well with your current work and all the grants that are due to go out. And I'm sure you are going to contribute a whole lot more. And we very much look forward to your population-based risk factor control. I completely agree with you. While individual risk reduction is useful, it's not particularly meaningful for us to see larger numbers. We talked about this multiple times on corridor discussions at multiple meetings when we could meet face-to-face in the past. Our good friend and colleague, Professor Valerie Fagin, probably has similar ideas also. And we very much look forward to seeing this, as it would certainly be quite meaningful. Your other point of different parts of Ontario having different risk factors, I can basically relate to that. My hospital basically look after patients representing well over 166 countries, different cultures, different food practices, different way of living. They throw different set of challenges to you. So it is very hard to prescribe preventative strategies while you know very well that community level preventative strategies are probably the best ways to promote brain health. So we very much look forward to seeing what you published, and we hope you could publish them faster, as that could go to one of our grant applications which is due in a couple of weeks' time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity of talking to you, and through this recording to many more of the colleagues that I hope to meet face-to-face soon.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. The world that we are going to see post-pandemic, whether it is 2, 3, 4, whatever the year's time, it has to be a better world. I am eternally optimistic, just like you are. We are a unique species. So we will adapt, and we will work together somehow. Take care and stay well and safe. My kindest regards to your family too.
Likewise to yours, and to your son in particular.
Thank you. Thank you.